Let's see if I can capture the water pouring out of this axle. It's hard to hold the camera and pull the axle at the same time. Most of it was already out by that time, but it had its share of water in there. And of course that ruins everything. You gotta, not the stub axle probably, but the bearings and the races. I'm disassembling this hub, and I need to get the seal out of back, and I tried different ways struggling to make it happen. And this is what I've found is the most efficient way of doing it. Let's see if it works while I'm trying to show it off. And I can do it without killing myself. Well, every other time it just popped right out. It's because I can't watch what I'm doing here. Here we go. Seal out. This cone was actually rusted in place. Couldn't pull it out by hand, had to give it a couple of whacks with a hammer. I don't know how I was able to move the vehicle around unless this bearing was just spinning on the hub, which must have been the case. It's ugly. This is a really great drift here that I used to punch out these bearing races. I was a little worried it might be too soft or something, but man, it just pounded them right out of there. And it's nice that on this vehicle, they leave you a pretty good lip on the bearings inside for you to get a hold of with a drift. Some cars, there's barely anything. Some cars only give you a couple of relief places that you can put a punch. And you really need to be able to punch all the way around, especially on an older vehicle. But they're out. They're crummy looking. So it's time to put the new ones. Well, I'm going to clean this up again. I gave it an initial cleaning. I'm going back to the tank, clean this up some more, and then we'll pound the new races in. The other reason I like this drift is because it's nice and soft. It's not hardened steel or anything. I guess it's brass. It seems harder than brass and tougher than most of the brass I've worked with. But you never want to use a hardened steel tool to try and pound these bearing races in, because I've actually chipped one hammering on the edges of it. I mean, ideally, I guess you would have a nice bearing pusher that was just the right size, and you put it in a press and squish it down in there, but that's not happening. I've always done these by hand, and it turns out well in most cases. This is the hub ready to receive the bearing race, and the race has to be pounded down flush with that flat surface, this surface right here. And when you're pounding it in, you go around 90 degrees out, keep pounding around sort of in a circle. You got to make sure that it's going in evenly. If it gets cocked a little bit, it becomes hard to drive. But if you keep it even and tap it on down there, it goes pretty well. It would probably be better if I had a more substantial surface to work on, a more solid surface, because that absorbs a lot of the whack that you're putting into it. But this is working okay. You just have to be tenacious and careful and drive it home. It's just about impossible to see how far you are from the seat, where the bearing's going to seat down in there. But when you're driving it down, it's got a distinctive sound as it's moving, and when it hits that seat and gets firmly seated on there, you get a different kind of thunk out of the whole thing, and you'll know that it's happened. And here comes the messy part. We're going to grease up these bearings and pre-install them in the hub here. A seal has to go behind this one, so we do it first. And I got my own theories about this stuff. A lot of people pack the inside of this hub with grease, thinking that somehow it'll replenish the bearing. You could go into this bearing 3 years later and none of that grease would have moved. Grease works at the molecular level, so it's important to get the bearing races, the cones, full of grease so that you're sure that it's circulating around in the actual wear surfaces in here. But packing a ton of grease in there does you absolutely no good. I've got hubs that are, how much, TR6. The hubs have probably been in there for 50 some years and just keep right on rolling. So it's amazing how far these things can go, and putting a ton of grease in there does not portend extended life for this thing. I've got my inch and 16th nut, inch and 16th socket here for the wheel nut, and I didn't have a driver with a 3/4 inch drive that this calls for putting this thing back on. I've got a big old honking air gun that does have 3/4 inch drive for taking them off, which was very successful. But I found this piece of 3/4 inch shelf stock that I drove in there. It was a light drive into it, and didn't force it in or anything, but I figure I can use it with a good sized screwdriver to put enough torque on this to satisfy the requirement. I was kind of mystified as I was putting this back together about exactly which way the springs went, which end goes where. But when I got it all back together just like diagrams that I found on, Google, whatever. But when I got it back together, I found that turning this makes a little grinding noise. And I thought, that's really weird. And then I realized that this top spring in here is rubbing on the hub, the outer case of the hub. So obviously got to go back in there and flip it over, try and get it up and away from that. So that's what I'm going to tackle next. I've flipped this red spring over, so now it should be up high enough that it was obviously misaligned in there. Now it goes across there nice and straight. The long end, I assume, is meant to get past the adjuster cam that's right up in there, and it hooks on the pin. You can see the pin swedged on this side of the brake shoe. 2 of the brake shoes had these pins on them, 2 of them do not. And I got the hub back in place, not fastened down, but just stuck in place here, and nice and quiet, nice and smooth, just like it's supposed to be. So I got that spring off of there. Did the job.